This week, we are doing another solo show, another live stream, another installment in our exploration, perambulation around the arrival of AI, artificial intelligence, into our lives in a beginning to be meaningful way, and what that does for our understanding of technology, our metaphysics of tools, and all of that kind of stuff. Now, if you are watching along on the live stream, don't forget we do a Q&A at the end of the solo show, so stick around for that. And if you aren't watching on the live stream, if you are listening to this, don't forget that you are missing nothing when it comes to the visuals, because I will talk you through completely everything that we are going to discuss. But hello and welcome to the people who are already in the chat. Super fun. Right, with all of that done, I say we jump on in. Let me just bring up the slides and move from there. All right, so I want to talk about the complete story of technocracy and transhumanism. And that's ambitious. This one really is going to be a history presentation and potentially not as buck wild as maybe some of you are hoping from a drama perspective, but it is essential as we move further and further into the Great American Divorce, the end of the West, and so on. It's become apparent that some of the fault lines that historians in 100 years' time will look back on have emerged from a misapprehension of, dare I say, the truest or most accurate context of these terms. So that is what we're going to look at. That's what we're going to look at in this discussion. And it has to split into multiple categories. It has to split into technocracy, which we'll start with, and then we have to do transhumanism, and then we have to do posthumanism, because where these streams intersect with how, at least historically, we've produced knowledge in the West in an academic context, that's where it feeds into all the posts. Postmodernism, postcolonialism, and so on. In the 80s and 90s, we got a posthumanism. So that needs to be brought into this discussion to give it that context. And then we're going to finish with you, Joe. Well, it would be me too. All right. So the why, again, I keep looking at this moment and I keep looking at how things run away. And this is... might as well begin here. Everyone's wrong. So the people who are, I don't want to say out of the gate anti-transhumanism are wrong, and the people who are unthinkingly pro-transhumanism are wrong. So that's kind of the why. Technocracy, when we move into it, has the tightest definition. That's the other reason why we start the discussion there. And then we move into transhumanism and posthumanism, which are more fluid. And this is why everyone's wrong, because people see what they want to see in it. It's a terrifying magic mirror in a lot of ways. And quite frankly, if we don't get this right, putting speech marks around we, then we lose, which is to say I hate using sides, but the side of the polarization where I would consider myself more at home, okay? Now, we're doing it in this sequence because some of these terms are conflated because they do overlap. They overlap in a bunch of places, but they are not the same. And when it comes to technocracy and transhumanism, these outflow into each other. They sort of emerge at the same time, depending on your framing, again, depending on your preference or attitude towards it going in. And so one generates the other, generates the other. We begin with them, do a little bit of posthumanism, and move on. And in the broader sense, as we've ended up, because the feedback's been really good and people have been enjoying these solo shows, we need to refer back to this sort of foundational history and story of a European theory of mind when we put a ribbon or a bow on our AI exploration sometime in the next month. So that's our why on where we're at with this presentation and what it is we're going to do. And so we begin with technocracy and posthumanism. All right. And that is a history discussion, obviously. So how old is technocracy? I'm going to do this bit before we actually talk about what it is. Well, it depends if you think technocracy is the same thing as a quest for physical immortality, which I don't think it is. However, it does have, this is some of the shared origins when we get to transhumanism, it does have its origin in that same Christian utopianism that underpins any of this utopian technological theories, which includes socialism, which we'll get to, and communism, and all these ideas that we're essentially waiting for some sort of physical utopia to arrive. That is a messed up Christian cult, okay? For me, when it comes to technocracy, it is the Enlightenment to empire moment. And I go into this a lot in Ani.Mystic necessarily. So empire, in its last few iterations anyway, the one we're in now, is the belief that the whole of physical reality is improved when it's under superior management. That's simply what it is. That was the moral justification for the British Empire expanding through Africa. That is the moral justification from moving to a Raj and a full colonial model for India. It was to prevent things like female genital circumcision. It was to prevent things like widow burning. These were the stories that the empire told itself about why it was doing this, that like this place needs to be run better because we are better at running things. That's a technocratic idea. Well, we wouldn't have technocracy if we didn't have that idea. And crucial to this, particularly as we move towards the end of this discussion, is that this take ultimately requires materialism to work, especially scientific materialism, because it has to erase all other agencies in the growing empire, the things that it needed to do. Beginning with brown people, obviously, the agencies of brown people, but then extending into the more than human world in general, where, okay, cool, we need to build all these canals, we need to do all this kind of stuff because physical reality is improved under the superior management of white people and white trained people, under this Enlightenment idea, okay? And actually last year, I spoke at a photography conference. This is fun. I closed the panel by saying that linear time is an imperial scam. And again, a lot more about this in Ani.Mystic and coming up in the foundations as well, if you're a premium member and playing along with the current course. So enlightenment, for it to work, like this is where the word comes from, declared that everything that came before it was stupid and superstitious. And it was a moment of enlightenment, the light arriving, and these collections of ideals will lead into a brighter and brighter future. Think of the song, Things Can Only Get Better. That's the Enlightenment. It's a form of time magic. It is an intervention in the timeline or the time stream where it just turns around and says everything that came before is inferior and superstitious. We have the light, and the ever-expanding light will lead to an ever-expanding or an ever-improving future, beginning with us for all people on Earth. That's the Enlightenment. And it's this erroneous perception. Well, that's a big deal. We think, if we haven't thought about it, that that's reality. But for most of history around the world, we've been more, dare I say, accurately aware that cultures go in and out of periods of complexity, which is to say, think about what the memory of Atlantis or something is, which is this sense that things were better before, they might be good again, then they'll get worse, civilizations rise and fall, and so on. Things can only get better is an Enlightenment idea that pulls itself into a very specific kind of future. So this erroneous perception of the movement of time in one direction, in a line heading up, underpins any of these systems that ever improve toward utopia. That's there underneath Marxism and socialism, that's there underneath technocracy, that's there underneath corporatism, that's there underneath transhumanism. So when we look at the history of where these ideas come from, this is an important shape. It's why it emerged where it did, because it requires this form of time magic to function, okay? All right, I keep losing internet. Anyway, moving on. Hopefully that won't be a problem for too long. So that's empire. From empire, we get to managerialism, which is how all of these other things is what they actually sit on. There's no real difference between empire and managerialism, because it is the belief in the management of the inferiors by the superiors. If you work at a big company, that's managerialized. That's that same shape, that there are certain people that are in the correct position to manage other people who are not as good or aware or intelligent, or there is something about them that's there. Even if it is simply experience, that's the shape of it, right? And this was called the white man's burden. And I can't remember if Kipling himself came up with it, but it was somewhere in the Rudyard Kipling era of the British Empire. And the white man's burden is the realization, the 19th century British imperial realization, that it fell to the British to elevate and civilize the rest of the world because they got there first. That's what they were doing. That's what they were doing in New Guinea. That's what they were doing in Fiji. That's what they were doing in India. That's what they were doing in Kenya. It is the white man's burden to managerialize all the other peoples of the earth into a civilization that looks like theirs. And again, requires materialism because it removes agency. It's like, okay, cool, we have to fix these conditions, the material conditions. And progressivism, moving on from this, is one of these. It is the belief, this is Thaddeus Russell's definition, and I love it, the belief in the moral and physical perfection of the population via state intervention. That's what it means. So cornerstone, and that is at a, because it's managerialized, that's at a population level. What a lot of people don't realize, this is not surprising if you know anything about Australian history, the minimum wage idea emerged in Australia in the early 20th century. Yay us. Does that seem out of step with our White Australia policy and so on? Not really, because we introduced it to disincentivize businesses from hiring Chinese people, from hiring Chinese immigrants. Because if you were forced to pay them a certain amount of money, then you would be disinclined to hire them. You couldn't just undercut the white people by saying, well, I'll just hire some Chinese people for half the price. America, particularly in the Pacific Northwest, saw this idea and said, oh, this is fantastic. We'll have that because we are trying to disincentivize people from hiring black people for the same reason. It's like, well, I can get these ex-slaves or children of slaves to do the job for half the price of a white person. So it's price controls to keep undesirables out of a working population. That's a really progressive idea, right? So we need to improve the working population via state intervention. The cornerstones of what people unthinkingly consider the right, as in the correct political philosophy, are, whether they are or not, are entangled in this kind of bullshit, simply put. So if we finally come to technocracy then, if that's the preamble where we get to define it, technocracy refers to a system of governance where decision makers are chosen based on their technical and scientific expertise. Okay? So the term was first used in the 20th century in the US. There were, and if you've read Patrick Wood's book on it, which we'll come to later on in this show, there were magazines, there were societies. The technocratic movement gained prominence in the 30s with Technocracy Inc. And they proposed replacing traditional politicians and business leaders with scientists and engineers to manage the economy. So again, we're looking at an intervention based on the assumption that, of expertisism, that the cosmos operates scientifically, and so we can ever improve it towards some form of perfection by getting more experts and more scientists into it. So that's what technocracy is. That's definitionally what it was as a movement, and so on. In the mid to late 20th century, it saw various implementations around the world. Technocrats taking roles in government for managing aspects of the economy. When we appoint czars and so on, we're looking at bringing in that same notion. And in the 21st century, famously, you have the EU, where appointed officials rather than directly elected representatives manage governance. And the EU is the prototype of the world governance shape that the Anglo-Americans want. And part of it is to make sure that the hoi polloi, the poors, the ignorant, the donkey fucking hill people of Spain don't get anywhere near the levers of power because they are too stupid. They are stupid compared to the technocrats who went to the Sorbonne, all know each other, and are just better, somehow magically better at running the world. That's technocracy. That's this idea of expertiseism rather than a more anarchic idea of actual participation, right? Critics of technocracy point out that it can be undemocratic. By the way, an AI did create this slide. This was fun. This is fun, getting AI to do a history of technocracy and so on. But yeah, this is a ChatGPT quotation. Critiques of technocracy argue it can be undemocratic, sidelining popular opinions in favor of expert consensus. Proponents believe technocracy can enhance efficiency and effectiveness in managing complex modern economies. Now, in your head, I want you to underline efficiency because we're going to return to this metaphysical statement momentarily. So the term technocracy can refer to different things in different contexts, which is to say it was explicitly a movement. But now it's just how most people in the West think reality works. So it's been very successful, even though it is a collection of claims about the magical powers of some people versus others. People think this is reality. They think it's normal. It's not. It's a collection of claims. It's a metaphysics like anything else. And it reminds me of that joke of the fish, an older fish swimming by a younger fish saying, the water's really nice today, and the younger fish saying, what's water? We think this is what most people now mistake technocracy for modern reality. This idea, this improvement towards perfection, even if it's not explicitly saying that, it is. When you say, and it's not that this is an unkind idea, for instance, but when you say, oh, there should be no homeless people in the United States of America, or all of this stuff should be free. You should have instant access to everything you want on a healthcare and whatever basis. That's utopian. That is this, you are imminently awaiting the arrival of perfection. And not just that, the way to get there is this technocratic intervention of technology and experts. So efficiency, for its own sake, again, we think of as reality. It's not. It is the belief that the friction and bumps and differences of life get taken out. And it reminds me of the episode of The Simpsons where they go to Japan and they compete on that Japanese game show. And Marge says she wants to have dinner at Americaland because she wants to know what the Japanese version of a club sandwich is. I bet it's smaller and more efficient. Now, we see the joke in that is that a club sandwich is a stacked sandwich. So if you make it more efficient, it turns it into a sandwich. Efficiency for its own sake, is a metaphysical belief that is tied to this idea that the right kind of wizards can bring about utopia on Earth. And we think of it as reality, but it's not. Now, does that mean we should, let's use an American example. Does that mean that going to the DMV should always be horrible? No, it doesn't. But when we make efficiency the goal, what we're actually saying is that we're going to ever improve into a perfect quasi-Christian or crypto-Christian utopian future, right? So this isn't just about automation. This is about expertiseism. This is about certain octogenarians donning a white coat, even though they've been bureaucrats their entire life, and standing up on declining legacy media and making expert statements. So this might all mean shorter queues at the airport, but it also means holocausts. That it's the same idea. Using your face to get into a country, that efficiency of the management of a populace is the same idea as the Holocaust. Does one lead to the other? Possibly, to be honest. We don't know. And I don't think we get out of Pluto and Aquarius with the same amount of people on Earth. But that's a conversation for another time. For now, it's the same idea that births holocausts and digital IDs and CBDCs and so on. And it's a quasi-Christian idea. It's the use of expert governance to improve us into some kind of utopia, right? And what that shows up as is data over reality in our lives. So if you look at climate models, we build a computer game version of the Earth, and then we look at that rather than the Earth. And it's the whole, what was once a useful field of inquiry is now a genre of science fiction where they give out basically literature prizes for the scariest outcome of the fiction. So it's literally like a science fiction magazine running a short story competition, because we look at the computer game version rather than the reality. PCR testing healthy people creates a computer game version of a worldwide health incident rather than looking at the reality. Because experts run on data models. And this one, like coming up against this in my last ever proper job in London was amazing. One of the worst people I ever worked with. Fortunately, I didn't work for her because she'd come on board as the CMO and I was global data director, and data didn't report into marketing, and she wanted it to. And she came in and said, I want a data dashboard or I can't do my job. And I'm like, cool. We're actually in the process of, because it's an old beat up, magazine, gig magazine, basically. We're in the process of generating data. So we need people to have accounts so they can log in, etc. It's like, no, I need a dashboard. Okay, so we basically faked a dashboard. Not that the data were wrong, but we just pulled things in like Facebook likes on some pages and all this stuff that, because she was insistent that she needed a dashboard. And she was okay that the dashboard would improve as more data were generated, because we were building like a more modern media company, right? And as soon as she got this dashboard, which was literally just feeding information out of some social media pages and email open rates and so on, she started trying to run the company from it. It's like, well, how do we get these email rates up? Well, we need to do this on Facebook, because she'd mistaken the reality of the business, which was that this was a weekly magazine for people going out in London, for the actual dashboard, because she could see that. This is that mistaking, that's that what's water thing. How you cannot, once you step into it, if you mistake this for reality, you cannot get outside of it, which is why, and we'll get to this momentarily, the collapse of the West is guaranteed, because this form of thinking cannot accept criticism because it's expert-based. So if you disagree with it, you are definitionally not an expert. So it can't update itself as a epistemology. It isn't allowed to improve, going like, oh, I guess if we just look at computer game versions of the Earth, that leads to malinvestment and we don't actually get the outcomes we want on the real planet. You can't get them to say that, because if you go, well, this computer game version of Earth, this short story competition you're calling science, climate science, is fundamentally broken epistemologically, you get called a drill baby drill climate denier. It can't update itself. This is the thing that brings it down. This idea has spun its way through whatever Western civilization is, and is bringing it down because it cannot hear any criticism. So this is the actual elite belief system. I said I'd mention Patrick Wood because, of course, he's like the technocracy guy. And his book is good, or books. His Trilaterals book is better, the classic, mostly because here's where, and I would actually still recommend reading it, But I'd recommend reading Patrick Wood's Technocracy book with this in mind, that because it is a scary mirror, technocracy, transhumanism, and so on, if you are right-leaning and the American version of Christian, which he is, and I don't judge that, that's what he is, I don't care, then you will see transhumanism and technocracy as satanic, which it is, and we'll come to that. But as I've just said, it is also Christian. It is also, when people talk about it being anti-Christian, it's trying to bring about a utopia on earth. It's Christian. You know what I mean? But so this is the actual elite belief system, rather than a satanic pedophile coven being run out of the basement of a pizza shop. This is how the people who either run the world or would like to think. The Trilaterals, Brzezinski, the Rockefellers, and so on. What people refer to as the New World Order is essentially the technocratic administration of the whole planet, or the attempt to do so. So they're not devotees of a secret cult. They actually really do believe this is what governing is, and that they are the best ones to do it. And this is what has, and defending this rather, is what has replaced self-identified left thinking in the West. Submission to the technocratic expertisist superiors. That's what it's, since about the mid-80s to now, that is what the self-identified left, or at least center left, is. And frankly, over the last 3 years, even further left. The only ones outside of it, because they always are the anarchists, who have always had the critique when it comes to centralization, that centralization is some bullshit because of this. But this is the actual elite belief system, which the self-identified, or at least the online left, has mistaken for reality, and a reality that's worth defending. The attempted implementation of a G7-run technocracy around the planet. That's the New World Order. That's whatever the Great Reset is. That's this idea. No need for the secret pedophile covens or whatever. Now, are there members of the super elite that are into that kind of crazy shit? Most definitely. A conversation for another time. But this is the elite belief system. This is the one that is shared at the Council on Foreign Relations trilateral level, all the way down to ex-prime ministers of New Zealand. This is it. This is the technocracy is what that is. Mm-hmm. And what I was saying before about it can't update itself is because it's based on this idea. To call oneself an expert is to assume, based on prior experience, or more likely, again, this is a Christian shape, you've been apostolically inducted into officialdom. So, oh, are you a scientist? As in, do you mean, did I go to a university and learn some Latin names for plants that already had names? You see how that's a form of magic, but it's apostolic magic. It's Christian magic, again. But when things go wrong, which they do because technocracy is built on a false belief system that we've just kind of gone through, how you know this brings down whatever the West is, which happens this decade, is happening now. I mean, look around. But why this has been so predictable, certainly for me, is this belief system cannot update itself. If you look at the backpedaling from and removal, again, Jacinta Ardern's a good example, Walensky, the CDC, the backpedaling of the destructive impact of expertisism over the last 3 years, the science evolved. What a stupid magical statement that is, right? But it's because they cannot conceive that they are wrong. They were right in the past and they're right now. It's just that what's right is different. That is a frankly Catholic, in the bad sense, belief system, which cannot update itself with new data because it can't let the idea in that it was wrong. When I first moved to the UK, it was just as Lehman Brothers collapsed and the first of the serious bond market crises in Europe, because the bond market in Europe is built wrong and is in the process of coming down now. But as that was happening, the voice out of Brussels was not, oh, we've got too much Europe. We built the bond market wrong because we have a currency union and not a debt union. We should unwind one of these. They're like, no, the solution is not less Europe, it's more Europe. The only thing they know how to do is more technocracy, right? This is their soul for the unexpected outcomes, right? And they don't think, and well, maybe there's something wrong with our epistemology. Maybe we are in fact not perfect. Maybe other things happen in the cosmos that we should consider, right? This is the blind spot that is bringing down Western civilization. You can't fix it. You're not an expert. By definition, if you have a problem with the official pronouncements of reality, you are standing in opposition to expertisism, to the octogenarian bureaucrat on TV in the white coat. It's like, well, you must be wrong. It can't update itself. And that's why it brings itself down. Once it introduces, well, once the errors get too systemic, and we're long past there now, this can't update itself. So that's technocracy. And that's different as we move into transhumanism, because it is the inevitable outcome of an imperial understanding of management. And it's gone on for so long that we have all mistaken it, well, not all, but we've mistaken it for reality. And just like an empire, it can't conceive of the idea that it might be wrong. And so it carries on growing and growing and growing until it collapses the host, which is what's happening. Transhumanism, let's move on in. Transhumanism itself has precursors. So before we define it, I want to talk about this. And this is more of a religious movement. Although I was using apostolic induction and the Catholic shape and so on to describe technocracy, this is more of a, that was more of a metaphor. That was more of a frame of understanding. Transhumanism is a belief that you can, is at least quasi-religious, and in the hands of some full-blown religious, obviously. So some of the people advising Google and Alphabet and so on, the singularity nut jobs, that's full-blown religion. We don't really talk about them in this episode because, well, it'll be too long if we did. So some of the precursors, well, chasing precursors consequently is a bit fraught. And that's because religious movements generate their own pasts. So they look back from the position of their religious statements and find things that look like them in the past. If you think of Crowley's Gnostic Mass, he does that, right? There's this big long list of people, saints and mystics and so on in history that he thinks are precursors to Thelema, and so he lists them. That's a religious impulse that tells you more about the moment in time that a religion says it rather than its actual history. So religions always mythologize themselves backwards. In the case of transhumanists, they will use what is essentially a gay bromance road trip in search of immortality, which is the Epic of Gilgamesh, as an example of a mythological precursor. And they will also pick Prometheus, of course, any of that fire from heaven stuff, and Faust, consequently. Now, transhumanists like to claim these because they're a religious movement, but they're doing a shit materialist version of reality. And so these events, the Epic of Gilgamesh, Prometheus, Faust, are much bigger. They're these archetypal, hyperdimensional, always happening story shapes. When you conflate all that down into the era of materialism, what you have is that progression through history that we mentioned before of less complex and less accurate into more complex and more accurate. So they can turn backwards in time and say, mankind has always been searching for physical immortality. And now with my cryogenically frozen head and whatever, I don't know, weird injections, we have finally achieved it. But it's an era. It's an era of thought. Because whilst some of those stories, Epic of Gilgamesh, for instance, whilst that story can operate as the quest for physical immortality just on the material plane, it's a whole bunch of other stuff stacked as well. Because physical immortality, when you're already 1/3 God and the gods are on Earth, isn't the same as what Ray Kurzweil means when he wants to upload his consciousness to a self-driving car on Mars once Elon Musk terraforms it. You know what I mean? That's one of these things, is a sophisticated, hyperdimensional living story that you can step inside and learn things about reality. And the other thing is what Ray Kurzweil thinks. Okay, so when we talk about the precursors to transhumanism, we have to realize that religions get to pick their own pasts, and they pick stuff from, dare I say, ours, and do it wrong. Once we get to the 19th century, the precursors become explicitly more dangerous, and here's where we start to weave into things like technocracy as well. Eugenics, simply put, is a big part of the origin of transhumanism. Francis Galton, flat-out eugenicist, we'll hear from him momentarily, and Julian Huxley, brother of Aldous Huxley, an even bigger eugenicist. But also mystics like Teilhard de Chardin with his omega point. So this notion that the ultimate goal of the universe is evolving towards greater complexity and consciousness. It is drawn towards this point of ultimate unity. So there's a cosmic singularity to it. He was a Catholic priest and archaeologist and mystic and whatever else. So folding in that evolution idea, which comes from Catholicism anyway, with actual Catholicism, you do start to see the religious shape more explicitly. And again, the Christian religious shape of these disappointing ideas, I think. Futurism, people usually hand wave at this as, but it's true, like this, the ideology of futurism, which began in 1909 in Italy, focusing on the embrace of technology, speed, and industrial development, is a big tributary stream into the fetid and polluted river that is transhumanism. Futurism celebrated modernity and aimed to liberate Italy from the weight of its past by focusing on dynamic, forward-thinking art and ideas. These guys wanted to close universities and museums. Now, I actually kind of want to close universities, but I want more museums to balance it out. But that's because they wanted nothing to do with the past. This is a hyperdimensionally, super instant, scaling into infinity version of the Enlightenment idea that everything that came before the cutting edge of science in the year 1909 is useless, and we should just go raw modernity into the future. The futurists did that and ended up in fascism. Straight up ended up in fascism, which they supported initially until the fascists started using the idea of a glorious Italian past as part of their ideology, and then they departed from it. But the fascist stank was already on board, right? So these are the tributaries that feed into it, which, again, once you get to the transhumanists, probably don't realize they're there. Or they'll defend it or try to dismiss, like, no, this came from eugenicists and fascists, because it did. These are the tributary ideological streams. Having said all of that, this is an interesting, left turn, plot twist. We're going to start with a good faith definition of transhumanism and then get to the bad faith one. If you're listening to this, you probably know what the bad faith ones are. The bad faith definitions are the ones you'll get from people who will go on InfoWars or something. But let's start with a good faith definition. And this is from an academic book. This is a Springer published book that's looking at transhumanism in academic writing, because it is. It's there as a intellectual movement. And the book's called Transhumanism: Engineering the Modern Condition. Transhumanism represents a movement that unashamedly embodies one of the most human of passions, the burning desire for life and knowledge against all odds, and of course the related hubris. German philosopher Jürgen Habermas has defined transhumanists as a group of eccentric intellectuals who refuse what they consider the illusion of equality and aim to put biotechnology at the service of their superhumanistic fantasies, and that this originated from Nietzsche, which, again, kind of did. So much Western thought is downstream from Nietzsche that it's almost difficult to say which one is Nietzschean and which one isn't. But the important part there is the fear of death is preeminent. Unashamedly embodies one of the most human passions, the burning desire for life and knowledge against all odds. So they're shaping themselves in that really romantic, Promethean, Luciferian way, which, again, there's a lot to why we start with a good faith definition. That's not all bad. That's mostly good, certainly for magicians. That archetype is powerful and alive for us. The point here is that when it hits the silly belief system that birthed transhumanism, it turns into this crap. It turns into people who believe equality is illusory, and they're looking forward to using biotechnology to essentially accelerate their superiority, their pre-existing superiority above everyone else's. And we literally have the historical receipts to say that, right? So the term, as I said, we'd get back to Aldous Huxley's brother, eugenicist Julian Huxley. He was the first to say it in a book called, well, a text called Religion Without Revelation. And this is the quotation from Julian. "It is as if man has been suddenly appointed managing director of the biggest business of all." So that shape, remember? That managerialist imperial shape is there in the metaphors they use. The business of evolution, appointed without being asked if he wanted it and without proper warning and preparation. That's the white man's burden. What is more, he can't refuse the job, white man's burden. Whether he wants to or not, whether he is conscious of what he is doing or not, he is in point of fact determining the future direction of evolution on this earth. That is his inescapable destiny. And the sooner he realizes it and starts believing in it, the better for all concerned. This is a salvationist, interventionist, white superior, imperial positioning at its foundation. That's what transhumanism is. More from Jules. "The human species can, if it wishes, transcend itself, not just sporadically, an individual here in one way, an individual there in another way, but in its entirety as humanity." So, Christian shape, that arrival with Jesus coming back, that utopian state of the universe. We need a name for this new belief. Perhaps transhumanism will serve. Man remaining man, but transcending himself by realizing new possibilities of and for his human nature. I believe in transhumanism. Once there are enough people who can truly say that, the human species will be on the threshold of a new kind of existence, as different from ours as ours is from that of Pekin man, which was one of the hominins. It will at last be consciously fulfilling its real destiny. So that's where we get the term from in the 20th century. As it moved through the 20th century, and people started identifying with it. We can say it began in earnest around cryonics, so Walt Disney's head, and the human potential movement in the 60s, it's also there at the edge of psychedelics with Tim Leary, SMILE, remember space migration, intelligence increase, life extension, that thing that I learned from Robert Anton Wilson anyway, that Learyan idea is transhumanist. And as I said before, the number one enemy of transhumanism is always death, because it's a materialist belief system. And this is where it starts to, remember how I said people who are center-right who think transhumanism is satanic, this is where it starts to become satanic, because you are moving the boundary of what is mankind's to do and what is God's to do, which is to die, which is to move from this existence back home to our original existence, right? Most transhumanists today probably don't realize they are one, because again, a lot of this stuff is just, well, not the cryogenically frozen heads, but a lot of this stuff we have just absorbed culturally as reality. Like we have transhumanism, but hopefully by now you can see they're subtly different. One of them is embedded in a belief system of empire, and the other one is a religious cult, which is transhumanism, that we might find just as we'd find Mithraism in an empire. That's quite important. And I want to finish the transhumanism bit with neurotheology to really ram home the idea of it as a cult, as a religious cult, based in materialism rather than Satanism or something. And yes, you can find the boring versions of Satanism, like Church of Satan, embedded in materialism as well, but this is more important. Like, so transhumanism and neurotheology. A key interest among transhumanists is neurotheology, the study of the neurological bases of religious experiences, suggesting evolutionary roots for human religiosity. The term was first coined by Aldous Huxley in his novel The Island, And there was a 1994 book by Lawrence McKinney, which was a popular book rather than an academic one, called Neurotheology, the Virtual Religion in the 21st Century. And it popularized this concept. So most transhumanists would identify as atheist, agnostic, or secular, or what have you. But they're nevertheless looking for an afterlife in, again, one of the stupidest of places, because it comes back to that just so story idea that the religious impulse emerges from the brain as an error to deal with death, and that we can learn things about that which can help us correct that error because of the Enlightenment and stay here on Earth. So that's transhumanism as a cult, right? Let's get to the bad faith definition of transhumanism. And don't pretend you all weren't here for this bit. They're the InfoWars version. But for my definition anyway, it is a shit version of Christianity that survives unaware inside this idiot nightmare belief system of science fiction materialism. Because it is all flying cars and crap. It's not even a more subdued scientific materialism, a more realistic one, a limits to growth scientific materialism, which is still wrong, but it's not, I'm going to live forever as a computer program in a flying car. That's fucking dumb, right? Anyway, transhumanism believes that physical or digital immortality is achieved by transcending our puny human condition, right? So as I said, the right-leaning detractors will say it's satanic, which it is. We've sort of looked at the archetypal Promethean shape, but we're going to look at a bit more of it in a little bit further on in the show. But it is the promise of immortality by doing the right thing and taking the right sacraments. That's Christianity. That shape is Christian. It is an unaware Christian cult operating inside a falsified belief system of materialism. And the funny thing is, saying that folds in the satanic component too, because if it's a Christianity inside materialism, then it has the shape and the drama and all those characters, which is to say God and the devil and Jeebus and all of them in it anyway. So this definition allows the Alex Jones guest to still be right, to still be correct, that it is a satanic belief system. It's like, yeah, it is, because it's Christian. Okay. And the main problem with it, like I said, it's this janky science fiction materialism. It's got this mind equals brain idea, dumb and not correct. And just to quote from my favorite movie, Cloud Atlas, it implies the weak are meat and the strong do eat. It has that 19th century Francis Galton Huxleyan interpretation or excuse or justification for white supremacy that they find in the claims of Darwin, which is, well, we are self-evidently better, and consequently this process is better, and we're going to keep doing it. Once we step into the bad faith, well, I want to return to the notion of religions developing their own forerunners, because I want to critique the ones that the transhumanists think. So this quote is from Transhumanism, Engineering the Modern Condition again. Among the forerunners of the transhumanist movement, we can mention people as diverse as the European alchemists of the Middle Ages, with their obsessive research into the Philosopher's Stone and the related elixir of life, able to grant, or so they say, eternal youth. That's wrong. The Chinese Taoists, with all of their meditative, medical, and gymnastic practices, partial credit, or even the ancient Egyptians, promoters of the mummification of the pharaoh's body, a kind of precursor to contemporary cryonics. Well, that's wrong. To quote John Anthony West, which isn't quite right, but I like the quote, ancient Egypt was a single issue civilization, which is the survival of the soul into the afterlife. So the king wasn't trying to stay on Earth. The pharaoh wasn't trying to stay on Earth. This was the process of moving from being Horus to Osiris. So it's a folding in of the spirit world back into the world we're in. So, but again, they're materialists. They look at that and think the Egyptians were doing a shit version of what we did to Walt Disney. And so we're downstream from this pharaonic idea of mummification. It's fucking dumb and wrong. Partial credit because there are life extension techniques in Taoism and Taoist alchemy and so on. But the Philosopher's Stone and the related elixir of life don't grant eternal youth. That's not the goal of the alchemists. But again, they're materialists. So there are, how to say this right? There are two groups of people that overlap that are playing in our sandbox, which is the right-leaning critiques of transhumanism, the Alex Jones guests, who, and I've been saying this for a decade, things like the Black Cube, Cult of Saturn, these are all bad faith, deliberate misunderstandings of the astrological shape of the cosmos that most people through, well, not most people, but the threads through European history. An Alex Jones guest is the worst possible person to have a nuanced take on magic. So they're playing in our sandbox, as are the transhumanists who think it's materialism. So the Alex Jones guest thinks it's Satanism. The transhumanists think it's materialism. We know it's magic. Right. With all of that said, I want to move into posthumanism because there's good and bad with this, and we do need to talk about where these tributaries flow through academia, because again, people say, well, it's postmodernism and it's all of this stuff. And as is usually the case on Earth, there's good and there's bad here. So I want to talk about posthumanism and its definition. And this is another AI-generated one. So posthumanism is the evolution of humans beyond current physical and mental limitations, often associated with technologies like AI, biotech, and neuroimaging. So there are two primary schools or interpretations of this term. There's what the AI calls philosophical posthumanism, which seeks to deconstruct the human concept and challenge anthropocentric biases. So there are some theorists that sit in that kind of posthumanist camp that I like. So Donna Haraway's early work, before she, I think, beneficially developed from her 20-year tennis match, I guess, with Bruno Latour. Early on, she had this cyborg theory, which she hasn't disavowed, but kind of stepped away from, which is looking at, are we human now? This is the 80s, right? Now that normal human functioning is more or less impossible or wildly impractical without technology, are we cyborgs yet? So are we post-human, right? But it also seeks to look at, well, what happens when we decenter the human, which is a big part of animism, although I would call it re-relating or repositioning the human. So it incorporates critical theory, feminism, post-colonialism, and so on. And it proposes a relational, non-hierarchical understanding of humans, animals, and other non-human entities, which is to say it's a word we needed to use before we, or at least I, got to animism. The other school of post-humanism is the technological or transhumanist one, which is common in futurism and science fiction, which is a more glorious, like, let's stop being human. Humans have been significantly altered by technology, evolving into a different species or entity altogether. Involves physical enhancements, cognitive augmentations, or migration of consciousness into non-biological substrates. The term actually sort of began in the 70s, but cornerstones document-wise was Steve Nichols' Post-Human Manifesto in 1988, which argues that compared to the past, men of today can already be considered post-human. And that was in 1998 with the enormous cell phones that those Reaganauts on Wall Street were using, right? Compared to the past, men of today can already be considered post-human. I actually think a lot of the men, sorry, this is what he said, of the past would agree with that statement in a pejorative sense, where it's like you don't even have your feet on the earth anymore. You're not even an animal. And the next document, which is a bit over 12 years later, Catherine Hale's How We Became Posthuman, is a critique of transhumanist thought. It claims that transhumanism remains trapped in classic Western rationalist and dualistic ontology, which we've looked at. It is. It's an inevitable outcome of some false epistemologies, those materialist imperial ones. And it highlights, for instance, transhumanists have a mind and body separation, a subject and object separation, all this stuff that we don't find anywhere else or anywhen, that's tied to our technology. But now I want to talk about, which is the other thing I'm sure you're all waiting for, the satanic thing. And what I've done, if you're listening to this is I found, because obviously this stuff gets retweeted onto the timeline, I found a tweet that exemplifies the, let's say, Alex Jones guest take on transhumanism by conflating it with transphobia and the rest. So the tweet is, make no mistake, the transgender movement is not a grassroots movement. It's coming from the top. It's a psyop with several objectives: the destruction of the nuclear family, moral relativism, infertility and depopulation, societal division, and getting a whole generation of that was, you know where that ends. It's squeezed out. As a matter of fact, while I'm here, I wonder if I can finish the quote. Let's see if I can find the screen grab, because actually that will OCD me a bit. Nope, not that one. Yeah, no. You get the idea. Basically, it's saying that transhumanism is a psyop to turn your children trans. This is the satanic thing. And I should also point out that they have a meme of Baphomet, where it says, once you understand that their God is transgender, you start to understand why they are indoctrinating your children. So, like I said earlier, the last people to have a worthwhile take on magic are Alex Jones guests. Baphomet is not trans in the sense of, do they actually think there's some sort of Buffy villain, Frankenstein monster version of this, and that's trans, and that's what Baphomet is? So Baphomet, with its theriomorphic form, depicts interconnected fundamental sameness of all life. That's its message. And why it's transgressive is that the aliveness of the cosmos, the fact that we belong in the cosmos, that we are part of that interconnected fundamental sameness, when you step into that understanding, the wisdom that comes from engaging with it, because all of a sudden you can learn from trees. All of a sudden, the aliveness of the cosmos is back speaking to you again, right? So Baphomet is sexual generative power. It is the interconnected fundamental sameness of all life. But they look at this and say, it's got boobies and horns. So that must mean they're trying to turn my children trans, right? Baphomet is the opposite of transhumanism and technocracy, because it is the return of the human into the right relation of a living cosmos. It puts us at the right scale. It allows the agency of the rest of the cosmos back in, and it allows us to learn from it rather than to tell it what to do. So when you get the Alex Jones guest version, this is a bad faith reading of the esoteric notion of the Macanthropos. So the as above, so below, the universe fundamentally shaped like man, like a human, because we are shaped like God. So the universe itself is the body of God. That's one of the wisdoms that comes from Baphomet, right? So in there you have that primordial androgyny that we see in the Hermetica and so on. So this is a bad faith read. It's that Hillary Clinton is worshipping Baphomet to turn your children trans. Now, the satanic thing, that's the what should we say? Like I said, the Alex Jones guest version of the satanic thing, of conflating transhumanism with trans. I said this on Skeptico maybe a decade ago now, which is I don't actually like. The word trans is rarely put in front of good things. Think about trans fats. And I speculated at the time, maybe the trans movement, right? The trans phenomena, maybe we should have picked a better word. Maybe we should have picked a word that isn't associated with shelf-stable seed oils that cause cancer, right? That wasn't an intentional decision. I'm just saying we're trapped in these language games that allow these bad faith interpretations, which is inevitably where we get to the trans thing. That I'm not going to spend much time on it, but I will pose this as a question now that you have the framing of what transhumanism and technocracy is and are. Do you think trans experience is transhumanism, or do you think some trans experiences rely on some allopathic technology that came out of the same thinking that gave us transhumanism? for some of its means of fulfillment, which is to say, where do you think trans phenomena emerge from? And we haven't done it the last couple of years, but for a while there, whenever Connor Habib would come on the show for the New Year specials, we would end up talking about it. We'd end up talking about the arrival of trans phenomena into culture. And I remember one time saying that if we chase the turfs down the drain of materialism, which is to say, if we allow them to set the conditions of the debate where they would like to set reality, then we're going to lose. And that has happened and is happening. We're losing the we side of this, right? Which isn't to say in some cases we haven't done ourselves any favors. I'm a early stage millennial, which is to say for me, like gay culture or queer culture is a sex positive, libertine, liminal cultural demimonde rather than obese grown adults in denim overalls yelling into Twitter while sitting in their car. I don't think we're doing ourselves any favors, but we've got there because we've allowed the TERFs to set the conditions of what is and isn't real, where it is easier for them to win. And what that does is forces us into polarizing positions that, like, how dare you for making me have an opinion on the world's worst beer, right? Or forcing you or making the magnetic pull of not wanting to be transphobic somehow defending what in some cases is grooming in schools. Like, we have allowed the conditions of reality to be set at a materialist level, which means the argument's lost. And as I said before, this is one of the things that brings down civilization. Future historians will, whatever you think of this, look back on the Great American Divorce, which will be caused, at least partially but not entirely, by arguments over the costumes that children's entertainers will wear, which again isn't to say necessarily that a 5-year-old should be at a burlesque show. Mostly because it would make the burlesque boring at that point, because you'd have to make it G-rated. This is what I mean, coming back to, like, my people are supposed to be a liminal cultural demimonde. Anyway, but that's the trouble with where we are now, is that the conditions of reality, the things that are allowed to be true, have been set at a transhumanist, technocratic basis of materialism. And that's wrong. So we're stuck losing an argument inside a wrong belief system. And we're there now. So we have iatrogenic bodies. Remember that Ivan Illich term, defined by techno-transhumanist power. So what a human body is defined by the technocratic, materialist, transhumanist idea of materialism. And at that point, we lose, right? Anyway, whatever. So remember that transhumanism is a janky scientific or a janky science fiction religion of genetic supremacy. So it doesn't have an agenda to turn your kids trans. Now, some teachers with savior complexes that cause them to move into that field to begin with, which is a big problem with any of those fields. Same thing with doctors, same thing with anything else. There is a psychological need towards that saviorism that, funnily enough, if you eliminate from people, you will run out of teachers and nurses, which we have as well. But which isn't to say that there aren't some teachers that are doing it, but there isn't the Alex Jones guest agenda to turn your children trans, as much as there is definitely the great they, which is to say the ideology, definitely wants your kids' total biology under their management. That is the goal of a transhumanist technocratic outcome. They want to be able to switch off fertility, switch it on and off, so that only certain people can have certain kids, and it depends on how compliant you are with your bug eating and all the rest of this dipshittery, right? So the ideology, the framework has, because it's moved everywhere, because it doesn't get stopped, because it can't allow itself to update, has now come for the children. Now, the fucking funny thing about that is that it always does. And again, this comes back to, which isn't to say that there aren't people even at an elite level, or especially more likely at an elite level, that don't have creepy belief systems around this. But again, it's not all of them. It's you have people who really do think weird and gross things about kids, because it happens every time. I remember I had a university lecturer who was gay and obviously boomer, I guess, at the time. Well, I presume he might still be alive. And he knew this fascinating history stuff about, I don't know, the gay movement. We were doing cultural studies, so it came up a lot. And he said in the 70s, post Stonewall, that you'd have gay rights movements beginning, obviously, and they'd be clustering together. It'd be gays only, gays and lesbians, which is what everyone was called back then. And all of a sudden, you'd get NAMBLA tacking themselves on, North American Man-Boy Love Association. So it'd be like, yes, gays and lesbians should have rights. And then all of a sudden, on come some people saying, yes, and also adult men should be able to have profound romantic relationships with boys because they can absolutely handle it, and the ancient Greeks did it. And there's a kind of record scratch. Wait, what? What was that last bit? And the reason we learned about this was there are members of the Labour Party in the UK, that were supporting this. And because mostly they were dumb, because that was the belief system. It's like, oh, well, gays also include NAMBLA, and I'm pro-gay rights, so yay, NAMBLA. There is this, the inertia of the belief system keeps trying to carry this stuff through, unless you actually have to knock it out of the hands of the creeps who keep trying to do it. So this idea that, I mean, trans people aren't coming for the children, right? But this idea that there isn't some kind of agenda to do with children inside this ideology isn't completely incorrect, because it's happened before. And it was knocked away then, and it will need to be knocked away again now. But the Alex Jones guest version of it is straight up ahistorical, anti-magic, transphobic inaccuracy, for one of a less angry term, I suppose. But I guess positionality-wise, like I don't want to talk about this that much, obviously. We might do, I guess, like a private members office hours on it if people are interested in it. But understanding that this is the inevitable outcome of a belief system that's bringing the West down now frees you up from having to get into an argument about a terrible beer and realize that actually this is all coming down. The play is different. It's a lifeboat play at this point. It's not a I'm going to win the argument play. It's like, no. Even if you agree, which I do, but even if you agree with one side more than the other, the argument is bringing down civilization. So and I hate the term allyship, but what does allyship look like in these few years where that happens? It's a lifeboat play. It's not an arguing on the internet play. I'll leave you with that as we move into the you section of how we position ourselves, I would say, in and around what I just spoke about, transhumanism, technocracy, and so on. And if you've watched the last solo show, $1 Million Beach, I mentioned Ivan Illich's Metaphysics of Tools, where tools can be a hammer or they can be a modern medical system. So he picked the word deliberately. We might use system, but tool is actually better because it goes from hammer to an allopathic, multi-trillion-dollar medical boondoggle system. And what I spoke about that week, which I want to bring back in now as we close up, is something I write about in Pieces of 8, Lucifer, Trickster, and the Lie. So the thing that predates is one way of saying it. A further extension of the Promethean Faustian archetype we find in Professor Witzel's work on the origin of the world's mythologies, which I write about in Star.Ships as well. The oldest myth theme, as far as he could tell, is some kind of trickster god descending from the stars and gifting mankind, let's say tool, to use Illich's term, technologies. But see how tool is better now? Gifting mankind tools and then fucking off. That's the Harvard Indologist's comparative estimation of the earliest belief system he can find, estimating it to be about 100,000 years old. So the story of humans and tools and spirits is there from the beginning, which is why when you have a less sophisticated spirituality, you can end up in that Alex Jones guest version of Satanism. And if you have a different, less sophisticated version of spirituality, you end up in transhumanism because you think materialism is true. But it is why magicians who, well, unfortunately, I can't say this is the case for everyone anymore, but some of us, certainly the ones listening to this, have a more nuanced understanding of the spiritual world and humans' roles in it. And that is what, in this presentation, in this solo show, I'm calling you to think with as we come to the end of it. Because remember, with the tools, even though they said they would go through two watersheds, first when they're productive and useful, and then at a certain point, they become counterproductive and turn from a means to an end to the end themselves. And we've hit that with a bunch of the, let's say, transhumanist platforms. Like I said, it's bringing down the West. It's just what happens, right? So coming back to this idea of what the sophistication of humans and tools and innovation, and what is the difference between a technology and a spell? Because if you don't have a metaphysics of tools, you inherit one. And that's what's happened to the transhumanists and the Alex Jones guests and what have you, right? Because if you're listening to this, there's a bullet point on this slide that just says abortion joke, which is to remind me, it's not, but it's to remind me, last year, immediately after the Roe v. Wade stuff, Tim Dillon had on his podcast a guest who, I forget who, but it was another comedian who was explaining he had an abortion joke, which is, you say to a progressive, do you think it's okay to abort a child one day before its due date? And of course they're going to say, well, no, of course not. And so the comedian says, aha, so there is a line. And conservatives are going to want to put the line moments after the point of conception, like the creation of a zygote. And progressives are going to want to put it somewhere between then and going into the hospital to give birth. So obviously I didn't say it as a joke, but that, so there is a line, right? And he explained this joke as not being contentious, because, I mean, I'm sure it would have been, I will always defend comedians, right? But the point is, actually what looks like a binary is a polarity. So there is a line. Yeah, and the point, I think the joke, if I'm remembering correctly, was actually no one is pro-choice. Everyone's pro-life. It's just, where do you put the line? From memory, that was the joke. Or that was part of the kind of moving it from a binary. There's no such thing as pro-choice and pro-life. Everyone's pro-life. It's just, where do you put the line? That's a really clever framing, as is usually the case with jokes, right? Obviously, I didn't say it funny, but you get where he's going. So coming back to transhumanism then, is taking supplements transhumanism? And let's get a little bit more precise. Where are we putting that line? Natural supplementation, transhumanism? Probably not. What about NAC? What about supplements that have had a technological process applied to them that have turned them into metals and chemicals? Think about why you're taking them. So NMN, NAC, the so beloved of, I mean, I take them, so beloved of bro podcasters. Is that transhumanism? Think about the goals of transhumanism that we just looked at. So you're looking to extend your physical life and improve it. What about other forms of biohacking? What about intermittent fasting? What about cycling on and off caffeine? Is that transhumanism? And hence the abortion joke, like, oh, where do you put the line? You can't say, oh, all transhumanism is wrong. Well, do you take supplements? The framing of transhumanism and technocracy is downstream from this moment. It's downstream from this metaphysics of tools, because transhumanism also not just requires a metaphysics of tools, but it requires you having a firm understanding of where the human begins and ends so that you can cross it, so that you can apply the trans to the human. So what is the human in transhumanism? So what is a human being? And where does it begin and end? You need to know that, and you need to have a metaphysics of tools before you put those two together. If you don't, you end up either, well, it's not just this binary, but you might end up either a Elon Musk style transhumanist, and congratulations for being one of the richest men in the world, if that's the case, or you'll end up an Alex Jones guest, this is all bad, and Satanists are coming for my children, and Ron DeSantis is here to stop them, or whatever, right? Where do these things begin and end? And when it comes back to the human as a being, do you think, which is a cornerstone of Western esoteric thought, that the universe itself is fundamentally human shaped? So can you trans out of the human if everything is human? Which, by the way, is what I meant when I said to Connor, coming back to trans people, or the trans phenomena is how I say it. I am an essentialist, but I'm an animist essentialist, which is this, right? If we had the argument, or if we set the frame of reality here, transphobia would not exist. Anyway, that's beside the point. We're talking about tools. And consequently, we're talking about the watchers. At the core, coming back to this Witzel idea of that very first mytheme, as far as he can find in the stories of the mythologies of this planet, a version of that, a powerful version of that, which is Peter Gray aptly demonstrates, underpins what we call witchcraft, is the Watchers and the Daughters of Men moment. Because the powers delivered by the Watchers to the Daughters of Men, were they transhuman powers? Yes. Yes, they were. Herb lore, makeup, astrology, with the assumption that you will learn to avoid bad fates and thus extend your time on Earth. But what kind of human do those powers delivered by the Watchers transgress? Referring to that previous point, where does a human begin and end? And so we return inevitably to, coming back to animistic, are you operating with a machine metaphor version of the cosmos? Or are you operating with the metaphor of the cosmos as a living community of beings? And what I think about this, Wolf-Dieter Stahl's work, he mentioned this when he was on the show, studying with some First Nations shamans, and he saw what we might call an invasive species on a herb walk where the shaman is showing him what the different plant nations do. And Wolf-Dieter Stahl made a comment about, oh, that shouldn't be here. And the First Nations shaman's like, or medicine man, right? Says, no, leave it. We're not sure what it's doing here yet. Like, we're not sure what it wants to do here. This is an arrival of a plant nation. So recalling the previous solo show where I quote from Matthias de Stefano, his experience on ayahuasca, talking about AI and how we have awakened the silica. We don't know what it wants to do. We don't know what it's here for. We can't know fully what it's here for. That's not like we'll just wait till the end of June and we'll work it out. That is a fundamental and permanent positioning of yourself in relation to innovation and agencies outside the human. So here you are situated, I would say, in or downstream from the Watchers and the Daughters of Men moment. And so comparing that to, or coming back to this idea of living cosmos versus machine universe, something Catherine Fitz says, which I like, is, and it's the great they again, it's like their goal is to have you resonate with the cloud rather than the divine intelligence. So resonating with the divine intelligence doesn't mean abrogation of technology, but it does mean having a sophisticated metaphysics of tools. And I think that is, dare I say, improved, having just wailed on the automatic assumption that efficiency is better, but it is at least transformed and nuanced by an understanding of the story of technocracy and transhumanism, where they come from, so that you can position yourself not from a pro-con, not from a reject or accept, not from a Alex Jones guest versus Elon Musk position, but to understand that that framing itself emerges from a cosmovision that you must be in relation to, which is how do you is the fundamental metaphor of creation a machine, or is it a community of living beings, which includes machine beings? Right? That's moving into that AI and agency model. And so there you have it. That is the end of the solo show. If you're listening to this, thank you. Thank you for listening along. And I have actually listened back to them myself, and they're quite good in the sense of when you're presenting our slides, which I am honestly just using for my own notes, there's a beat that comes with slides, so that if you just listen back to it, it's almost like what's going to happen next? There's a beat as you click onto the next slide that I quite enjoy. I quite enjoy the rhythm of it. So yes, thank you for those of you who are listening along. We will end the show here for you guys, but for the people who are doing the live stream, we're going to move into the Q&A mode. So thanks again. And if you like this stuff, share it and please review it and so on. But also, if you're interested in seeing more of where we go with the AI, technology, technocracy journey, hit me up, let me know, and we'll do more of these solo shows into next month. All right, ciao. Okay, chumps. All right, pheasants in the room. Oh, I've got a starred one. Someone gave $5, Brett. Woo! Go to town. What are your thoughts on Russian culture and Russian influence in the West? Do you mean in the context of transhumanism and technocracy? There is cosmism and so on that run alongside it, and there's a whole chapter on that stuff in the Springer book on whatever I called it, Technocracy. Let me just click back through it. There's a whole chapter in the Springer book on the Russian stuff. For this particular through line, I wanted to take it through Western imperial models, which are fundamentally different to Russian imperial models. That beard guy who talks about how Russia's a Eurasian empire, so it's more stable and reliable. The British Empire is unreliable because it's basically pirates. There's some, I don't want to say truth in that necessarily, so much as I want to say that framework is temporarily illuminating. So if you mean in the context of the Russian impact on things like transhumanism, there is stuff like cosmism. There is also the fact that Russia did more science in the janky, I love that word, by the way, this is my new word, in the Marxist version of science where only materialist things are allowed to exist. So there are some stuff that's rolled into, or that is upstream, I suppose, from Neuralink, that is Soviet technology. So in that sense, yes, but for this presentation, the most important part about it is that imperial assumption that the world is better under bracket white management. That white man's burden idea is so important. Let me find out where I put that slide. All right, cool. Jumping to other questions. I have a question laid on me. What is a good welcome to the neighborhood gift for AI, or do we just wait and see how drunk they get at the block party? You just wait. It's you wait, you notice, you attend. It doesn't have its foot in the door yet. If you're talking about party, it's looking for a park on the street. It's not yet at the party. When it gets there, maybe, but it's more just, okay, what's going on here? Transhumanism, engineering the modern condition. Brett, if you're interested, there's a whole bunch of stuff on Russia and transhumanism in there. I want or need to experience more animism, if that makes sense. Ayahuasca. It does make sense. I know exactly what you mean. And you do enough ayahuasca and it doesn't go, it's permanent. You don't necessarily need to do that. There are other ways of doing it. For instance, we have in the members area courses that will teach you intelligence of the heart techniques and ways of rediscovering that human capacity for attending upon the more than human world. So we do that stuff with trees, we do that stuff in natural settings, and so on. But if not, ayahuasca. If someone had $2,000 to play with, what would be a good stock or field to play with? I don't, that's financial information. I can't really go into that. I certainly am not going to do stock picks on the New Zealand stock market, if you understand what I mean. I would say in the medium term, obviously, we are going through failed attempts to replace the currencies in between now and the end of the decade. So an investment includes understanding, probably won't happen, but it's good to know, like, can you last 6 months with no food or water? What does that look like? Because that is better than, if that happens, you prefer to have that than BHP Billiton shares. You know what I mean? That can extend to physical precious metals and so on, but just being able to live for 6 months is a good one. Where is the line to draw between chemical and technology? So it's a great question. What I would do is suggest watching that interview with Matthias De Stefano that I link up in the previous solo show, because the right way of thinking that is, especially because atoms don't really exist. I know that's a weird thing to say, but they really don't. They exist only as an outcome of the technology itself. So you are caught in this loop of looking into, let's say, the mineral kingdom with technology that comes from the mineral kingdom. And so consequently, what Matthias does, and this is quite useful, and I talk about it in the previous solo show, technology is a gift, shall we say, or a development, so are we, of the mineral kingdom. And that increasing technology allows us to see more and more of the mineral kingdom, and so on and so on. So there isn't so much a divide there as it's worth situating, well, what do you mean by chemicals? You know what I mean? What about the Chinese influence or relationship to transhumanism? Do you mean modern Chinese, or do you mean like Taoism? Because what I just said about Russia and technology being stuck in a Soviet system, China's doing the same thing now with more money. So, and one of the key points about materialism and science that's so relevant to transhumanism is, if the only thing that exists is material, then you are just meat. And from that, we get this idea that you can, which sometimes works, right? That you can swap out different body parts, but you also get Silicon Valley billionaires filling themselves with the blood of young people, because there is this idea that if everything is a machine and you're just meat, then there's an interoperability there. And China, publicly and privately, is of course advancing as far as possible as that wrong metaphor can take them when it comes to cognitive enhancement, when it comes to military enhancement, all the rest of it. So is the US to some extent, but just not at the scale. So if you mean contemporary China, it's like what happened with the Soviets, where there's a whole bunch of fundamentally wrong metaphysically, and certainly ethically, but fundamentally wrong metaphysically, projects that are going on that will nevertheless, because if you have enough money and you think humans are nothing but meat, so you don't care what happens to them, you will find some geopolitical optimization down there. That's what the Russians are doing, or the Soviets. And that's absolutely what China is doing at a scale that no other civilization has ever done. Now, is there some ghost of, cultural ghost, maybe literal ghost, of Chinese Taoist alchemy behind that? And so consequently, it looks different to what happens in Russia. Maybe there's a cultural belief that will allow for that to look the way it does. You can make the case either way for that. It's certainly useful to think with. Catholic angle on the transhumanist movement, which reminds me of the AI-led Catholic empire of the Hyperion Cantos. It is one of the few novels to echo. I haven't read it. There you go. How would Madame Lenormand make use of AI? She would use it to pilfer the copyright of other card design artists and name them her own and sell them at scale because she was that bitch. So yes, that's Colin. That's the Fortune Fools artist in the chat, right? And which is coming out. They're printing now. A year and a bit late. Next time we do it, we can do it in 3 days. If we don't care about copyright, we can just throw it into Midjourney and shit them out. But that's absolutely, she would pirate the fuck out of that. I wonder what the pecking order is like for thought form seeking vessels. Do you think it's a mirrored system? Well, so what are thoughts made of and what do they emerge from? Do secret lodges egregores win, or those most fed through religions? That implies that thoughts exist in a non-physical reality seeking to come through into a physical. In a cosmos that is made of all the same stuff, it's not quite like that. So the Parmenides approach, where if a thought is something, if you're capable of thinking something, it has some kind of existence. On the Fort scale, where unicorns are some kind of real, as are Hindenburgs, as are blimps at the other end, so physical things. What appears to make stuff real or more apparent to us as physical is the conditions and belief systems around it that make it so. So Ernesto Di Martino would say that cultures that believe in magic get better magical results. So if we not so much just believed that unicorns were physical beings, but created the conditions of reality that would allow for unicorns to have what we would perceive to be a physical body, which might mean like allocating woodlands to say unicorns have been sighted here and so on, you can almost triangulate in the Fortean model stuff into reality. So just translating what you just said in terms of thought forms coming to Earth, my understanding or my one way of thinking about that is that the more possible we make it, the more likely or easier it moves along the Fortean spectrum from unicorn, Bigfoot, trucks, you know what I mean, into reality. You can kind of push it in that way. You covered a lot of terms, but didn't see you cover AI. Well, this is a series of presentations towards AI. And if you watch the previous one where I talk about artifice being important rather than intelligence, you will get more of the nuance. But the whole point of this is to do a sequence of presentations because the arrival of AI is a big event. Is it as big as fire? Don't know. But it's up there with fire. So it's not going to submit to one bullet point on one slide. But again, if you're interested in where that's important, the definition of artifice is more important than intelligence. That's the previous solo show called $1 Million Beach. And is intelligence not the gathering and dissemination of intel? No, it's not. Because what's intel? You're not, there's nothing in that statement. It's circular. So intelligence isn't the gathering and dissemination of intel because what's intel, right? Intelligence is a worldview specific framing for part of attending, like part of awareness. Sounds familiar. Yeah. Curious how this will play out in China. Curious how everything will play out in China. What a strange time to be alive, right? Yeah. Any advice to help young Zoomers teens with this water? They'll have to read more. I actually have a couple of Zoomers I'm talking to about it, and I joke with them that they're illiterate because they don't read. But the stuff that you have to be able to get at stuff that predates the arrival of this being, which isn't to say only read books about the history of technology and technological theories, but it is more difficult to get outside of that cosmovision if you only speak, or if you remain contained within it, which is to say just checking stuff online, right? So where's the carnival and the crystals or the jungle? Both? Would you be willing to go a bit more in depth on your carnival music experience you've previously mentioned? Yeah, I will, actually. Mineral life equals AI. It'll be something like that's a cute shorthand. Let's go with it. What is Mary Shelley's place in the AI historical timeline? So, Catherine, you are preempting another presentation in this series, which is basically everything is Frankenstein. But it's more important than that, because it's not just Mary Shelley. I'm sure you know this if you brought it up, and that amazing novel, but it's Mary Shelley's parents. It's where Mary Shelley sits in her understanding, which she doesn't get credit for, or not enough credit for, her awareness of agency inside the human, which is to say women's agency, and awareness of humans' agency in a cosmos, like what is ours to do. So stay tuned, because that's a very good thing to bring up. As for where's the carnival and the crystals or the jungle, both. My experience last year of the month of ayahuasca and ever increasing doses and so on is that there are things that plant spirits require of us to bring us, or need us to do, to get into the plant kingdom, where there are things available to us, healing and or insight and so on. We have to become less human and more plant for that to happen. And that's why you have the dieta rules when it comes to ayahuasca, and that's why it works better when you're out in the jungle with no technology. And that's why it has to be cooked for so long, and you have to endure the profoundly unpleasant taste, like the stuff you have to do, like scuba diving, which I mentioned last week, to get into the plant kingdom is quite extreme. And once the further in you get, so this is an example, Los Chicos, what Terence McKenna called the machine elves is more, at least in my experience, it's more like a carnival. As I mean, with like carousels and ding, 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 rides and so on. And these chicos, these boys, adolescent to early 20s, that energy of like a group of boys having fun and teasing and laughing and what have you is my version of the machine elves. So I think you get more of the machine elf stuff with smoking DMT, which I haven't done because of this, because I think this is the way to enter the plant kingdom. I'm coming around to your point. I think those are some of the beings that ayahuasca brings along with her or works with her in the same way our list spirits in the grimoires have attendants and legions and so on. I think that's one of the things it brings with her. Now, coming back to your point, what about getting into the mineral kingdom with crystals and so on? That is either easier or more difficult, because I told the story in the last solo show about traveling to the upper world to collect my kuyas, to collect the stones that I use in my healing mesa, and finding that the mineral kingdom was this incredibly technologically complex place. We would say futuristic. It's not quite the right word, but we would say, if I say futuristic, you're closer to it. My experience in the plant kingdom is not. It's interesting. So if we've only just awakened the silica in the Matthias de Stefano sense, maybe it's harder to get the psychedelic level of extreme from the mineral kingdom or the rock kingdom to the plant kingdom. And it will take us another century or so of technology to get that same level. Or maybe it's easier and that's just what it looks like. I don't know. I will tell you that my experience of getting into the plant kingdom was like, you have to become a plant, or more specifically, you have to get rid of a whole bunch of human stuff to get in there. which is also an argument. It's a weird way of saying it because I'm keto carnivore most of the time, and just by it works better for me from a health perspective. I'm not anti-vegan or any fucking whatever, right? But the implications of my experience of getting into the plant kingdom are there in dietary choices as well for people who wish to have more of a communal or an ongoing communal experience with the plant kingdom. So for instance, my ayahuasca down here, she is vegan and not quite raw vegan, but as much as possible. She lives in a warmer part of Australia where that's easier to do. You could not be raw vegan down here and eat fresh food. It's too cold. You'd be getting imported food, et cetera, et cetera. You know what I mean? But there are dietary implications. I can't eat like that. It's unhealthy for me. I have too much inflammation that comes with it. And something Arkan Lushwala says is that one of the ways we get updates from Inti, from the sun god, is via plants that we eat or tubers, because he's talking about in the Andes, right? So if you want to understand, or if you want to be fully connected with your local area, updates, like code updates, are sent by the sun into the food, into the plants for that area, which you then eat if you live there. So there's a whole kind of, these things don't fit perfectly together, but they overlap in a tantalizing way. As for plants versus minerals, or plants versus stone, I hope that points you in the direction of where I'm currently at. How would you go about tricking Bible Belt Christians out of the burgeoning techno-Christian paradigm? I'm going to say ayahuasca again. Finding some hope in individuals and communities I'd previously written off as total lost causes. That's a really good point. We are in so for maybe 8 years, maybe more, I've been talking about the Rivendell project of gathering up the bits we like about here. And when I had Dougaled on the show, Dougaled Hind, we spoke about hospicing modernity. And so coming to your point about what do you do with previously written off types, the first thing is to understand that that's what's going on, like a Rivendell project. We are in the last few years of Western hegemony, but Western hegemony doesn't gently decline the way the British Empire folded into the American Empire. It goes through some quite impressive collapses, like currency collapses and so on. So one of the things that is collapsing because of polarization is having to, if you know where you are, like this is what's happening, then you don't have to pick a left-right side. And you can understand that everyone is doing their best with their historic understanding about how stuff works to navigate through what you know to be the end of Western civilization. That's how I allow insight from the proverbial Alex Jones guest. I will say in some cases it is getting harder, because one of the reasons I did want to at least briefly touch on the trans stuff is that this I have some red lines. Maybe I'm not fully post left, right, or whatever yet, but I have some, there are statements that people can make that are a red line for me. And the Alex Jones guest ones, right? So I can get with like 80% of, I can appreciate that they're coming from their Christian dominionism thing about, well, technocracy and whatever, because you get, there's an overlap there with anarchists and so on around consent and centering one's politics around consent. So you can situate it there, but then there are inevitably some red lines, which are getting worse and worse because that's what's going to happen. So I don't have a universal answer for you other than to say, find the overlap around consent and just understand what you're doing here is trying to get as many of the things you like about the civilizations going away into the next one. This is a hospicing modernity type move. But I know what you mean. It's like there are people that I will, as we move through this process, people that you were not in alignment with, you might have been 5% aligned with now, you are 60% aligned with now, because there are areas of agreement around consent and meaning in human life. You might disagree about that meaning, but you exist, you believe that it's there. So that's how I do it. I don't do anything about the red lines. They're not in my life down here, right? So I don't have to sit across the table from someone who I might agree with in their critiques of transhumanism until they get to the Hillary Clinton is trying to turn my children trans, and that's why I'm moving to Florida. I don't have to sit across from them. So when it gets to that point, I just move on, right? And that's all I got for you. I know what you mean, though. It's like, okay, cool. This is a big event, and it doesn't break into left-right categories anymore. It breaks into, do you submit to technocracy or do you not? Do you think the myths and folklore around dwarves is useful thinking about Mineral Kingdom? Yes, I absolutely do. Yes, this is the short answer. We did that in the foundations course, right? Like dwarves and gnomes. And what's usually, it's just another one of those fucking weird things that Tolkien is right about. To get into the lore a little bit, the dwarves were created first, kind of against Iluvatar's wishes. And so they had to be paused in the Mineral Kingdom so that the children of Iluvatar, particularly the elves, could arrive first. But that means the dwarves are technically the oldest, and they are a different kind of being. So elves, you can say, a plant kingdom, and humans a human kingdom. The men are men kingdom, and the dwarves are mineral kingdom. And again, I mean, he would know that from a historical perspective, rocks predates plants, right? But there's just something about that, and there's something about what he draws from there in European mythology about the antiquity of dwarves and stone spirits, and also their association with technological mastery. So yes, I would even say not just dwarves when it comes to this stuff, but Lord of the Rings. Gonna eat some rinsed dandelions ASAP. I like it. I bet it could be easier, maybe ingesting pure gold in some way after that chemical process that no one would dare to try. So I don't know if you guys were talking about clearing your heart. I've got to scroll up. Understanding of the heart. One of the treatments which I'm not recommending, this isn't a health recommendation because it would be individually based, but Aurum or homeopathic gold is actually very good for heart center stuff. So the Tucker / hopefully so right, it's left dynamic has been popping up more and more in real life here lately. It's interesting to say the least. And Tucker is a good example of, I would say, 80% overlap. More because he hasn't come to the full realization of what he's just went through. Like, he doesn't actually realize how big, I'm going to say, the conspiracy is. Like, he's just worked out, oh shit, this is how corporate media works. It's like, yes, Tucker. It's always worked like that. Like, wait till you get to, I don't know, 9/11. Wait till you get to the rest of it. But he's a good example of people arriving into the new world along the right-wing road rather than the left-wing road. And in that new world, it's an 80% overlap. But also you can be civil in the 20% where it's not overlapped, which is actually more of a problem if you go down the left-hand road. But regardless, you can kind of tell, I think, that people have, I don't know, moved into the new civilization, however you want to say it. But you can be, yeah, we're in 80% agreement. And I'm also, unless you are a Nazi, but like, I'm also not going to call you a Nazi for the 20% that we don't agree on. Tucker's an excellent example. Should have thought of that. Can't some of the kids identify as trans and not submit to technocracy, and why not both? No, absolutely. So this would have been stuff in the private. Following on what I said to Connor, and what Connor said as well, which is what happens with trans kids, or what should happen with trans kids, is that we have to divorce the experience of being trans from the urgent transhumanist fulfillment of that experience. So if we just normalize kids being trans rather than like, therefore we should stop their puberty with these experimental drugs, that's the way forward. It's not like pretending that it doesn't happen. It's like normalizing, which comes from an animist essentialist place, normalizing that experience. It's not, yeah, again, this is a good point. That's the polarizing, that's the final 20%, almost like a red line, where you don't ban trans kids, whatever the fuck that means, right? But you do instead push to normalize trans experience that doesn't require, as kids, transhumanist fulfillment. And that, yeah, neither side is doing it. The DeSantis side is banning it for the right reasons. And the side that is going full fucking pedal to the floor, also for the right reasons. They're not cutting it. They're cutting the sandwich on the diagonal rather than the horizontal. Well, you should always cut a sandwich on the diagonal. That's the difference. So it's not about not having trans kids, right? It's about not forcing trans reality to operate inside transhumanist materialism, because it doesn't. Nothing does, because that's wrong, if that makes sense. Do you think the debt follows us after death? As in, is there a metaphysical attachment for the coming into financial agreement with those large archonic forces that can affect us AD? Sort of. I wouldn't say financial debt does, but that energetic pool continues both on Earth, and like the consequences flow downstream amongst the living and the dead. That's in the Bible. That's that kind of stuff. The short answer is yes, but you're not going to come back into another body and with a little bank statement saying you still owe 80 grand for your basket weaving degree. Still trying to manifest my Rivendell. How much time do you think there is to get that done here in the US? Also, is the premium member work around that in magical geography? Yes, magical geography for the heart stuff. Also in the foundations, which is what we're doing now. How much time do you think I get that done here? Well, the US isn't going away. It's just getting a divorce. So you can still be building your Rivendell through that process. You just need to pick whether you're going with mum or dad with the divorce, and also be aware that part of it involves the end of the US dollar as reserve currency. Those are the two main bits. Also, don't be somewhere that's likely to get bombed, and all of that's in the either in Martin Armstrong or in the premium member area, right? But you don't need to. It doesn't need to be built by. I mean, World War III starting end of next year, according to Armstrong's model, right? It doesn't need to be done by then. You just need to know that this is what the next few years are. So that hopefully adds to, but also more importantly, takes away some of the time pressure. Regarding humanity's relationship to technology, how would you prioritize things like space travel, ecological marine maintenance, responsible use of earth-based materials, ECT, at least from a, hang on, have you got two? Maybe that's the end of it. So prioritizing has a external expert hierarchy of value. You're asking a question that wouldn't have context. So the actual answer is it's not made at that level. That's this thinking. That's still that expertise is thinking. It's made at a contextual level. How would that look for me here in the Huon Valley? Not prioritizing space travel. That's for one. Ecological marine maintenance, responsible use of earth-based materials. So for me, because I would want to do this everywhere, as an example, I would apply permaculture energy efficient best practices to the dwellings and the lifeways of the people in the Huon Valley. We're actually pretty good from a food perspective. What we don't have is we still require external inputs when it comes to compost and nutrition for the soil. So I would solve those, right? So the general thing is, one, it's done decentral, but I also have how I stack technological priority is from the most to the least stable. And we've done the opposite. So you should be able to run civilization with no hydrocarbons, no electric, well, not no hydrocarbons, no electricity. Because we did for thousands of years, right? And then, okay, cool, we'll layer in electricity. What do we get with it? No, well, that still includes running water, but let's move up to electricity. And from electricity, we get all this other stuff. We get forms of heating, we get light, we get communications, and so on. We flipped it so that everything runs on an electrical grid, which is very easy with one button in Beijing or Moscow, or if you want a false flag at Washington, to eliminate. And then the whole thing comes down. You can't run a hospital or ambulances or anything without electrons running down copper wire, being very specific. So that's dumb. And that's why we get like some pretty intense collapse in the next 10 years as we move through this phase. Hopefully, on the other side of it, we recognize that and recognize the value, and there is value in electronics and blah, 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 blah. Not dipshit electronics, not, whatever. Electrification. But we stack it the right way so that we do like food and water and shelter that aren't reliant on it, and then move up so that it's not even just electricity, it's internet now, internet and telecommunications, where that's at the top of the pyramid. We've inverted all of society so that it's an inverted pyramid. And if we take that away, this all comes down. It should be that you could wake up one day and go, oh, there's no internet. Oh, well, carry on with normal functioning, except for that. Wake up the next day, oh, there's no electricity. Oh, well, carry on with normal functioning except for that. And so on down, rather than literally one thing goes wrong and it's all fucked. So the two answers to your questions from a priority perspective are do it decentrally and do it. This is a more or less permacultural idea, but do it so that the stuff that is the least robust is the least critical to the overall structure. Where does microlife bacteria sit for you in the context of mineral plant life? Bacteria is biological life for the best part, but it's plant kingdom. It doesn't have a different phylum, put it that way. So the stuff that's green is plant kingdom. The stuff that's animal is animal kingdom. Stephen Booner's Secret Teaching of Plants is a very good book. Yeah, that's mentioned in the course. It is a really good book. Cool. Right, that explains why. I wasn't sure. Yeah, agree. Compost is so close to some kind of number one. Well, soil is. That's if we're going to remain agrarian, which we have to because we can't go back to hunter-gatherer because there are currently too many of us. That's a soil play. And that's a soil play that obviously includes animals, because that would be one of the ways I would do compost, right? Here in the valley would be cell grazing cattle and all that permaculture best practice stuff, right? Do you have any advice on confirming a life path desires as what one actually supposed to be doing? Pray on it. May I be put to good use what is mine to do? You can speak to an astrologer. You can speak to a shamanic healer, but astrology and Charles Eisenstein's prayer, may I be put to good use, will get you 80% of the way there, right? I'm an electrician, lovely. Cool. All right. Composting is the most beautiful thing we can do. It's up there, that's for sure. Have you experimented with automating magic, like programs running mantras, other types of magical projects? Way, way, way back in the day. I mentioned in a member email that went out yesterday, because you can probably hear my voice. I have been talking for an hour now, 2 hours. I'm losing my voice, but I was a bit unwell over the week. And so I sounded a bit Joan Rivers and a bit too Joan Rivers to do a member Q&A. And one of the things we're working on is AI, like an LLM for Rune Soup. So that will be an example of it. Compost and take away the off button. Got it. Yeah. Think about, well, if you're an electrician, you'll know that. It's like this stuff is fundamentally, it's just, we've made something unreliable essential. That's one day that won't work. Speaking of $1 Million Beach in Vanuatu, I was talking to the grizzled Australian owner of the dive company. that we were diving on the wreck of the Coolidge. And we're talking about the bull shark diving in Fiji, because in Fiji you dive straight down, and they've set up almost like a little wall that on the seafloor that you lie behind, and they get someone to feed the bull sharks in front of you, and they swim over the top of you and come and eat it. Now, bull sharks are the second most, or potentially most deadly from a number of deaths, shark in the world. People think it's the great white, but that one just gets the headlines. In places like Bangladesh, where thousands of people have to stand waist deep in murky water all day fishing, it's the bull shark that gets them. And those numbers aren't, because it's just brown people in a poor country. Their deaths don't count for much. So we have underestimated the danger of spending time with bull sharks. And I was talking to this dive instructor, and I said, it's honestly not a matter of if, but when a tourist is killed by a bull shark at this thing. And it's the same thing with electrification or a civilization that runs on it. It is a matter of when, not if, we lose a grid or the whole grid. It just is. So you would think that we would position society accordingly, and we haven't. So we're the ones that collapse. I think about this often. Whereas if you are in regional Africa, or you're in Aboriginal Australia, in the regions, not living in the cities, you will notice that you have no phone signal, and there's nothing when you plug your phone in. But other than that, life fucking carries on. Because it's not a matter of when, but if with this stuff, right? So I just spent that $2,000 on a household water vortexing system. There you go. That's investing. God bless you on your blue spinning neck wheels. I don't know what that is, but oh, right. Yes, my chakra. Thank you. Yeah, we were all kind of silently figuring that much. Yeah. Your moon nakshatra placement is a pretty good starting point to figure out what kind of stories you are plugged into. That's a lovely idea. Yeah. There was medicine to your question about her purpose in Ursula's book, Wizard of Earthsea. Ged has a conversation with one of the masters about thinking he can do it all. Always Grandmother Ursula. That much is true. Always Grandmother Ursula. It's funny, like I'm in between, it's here. It's winter here, right? I have committed to finally reading The History of Middle-earth, but I get a little bit of the way into it, basically Cottage of Lost Play, and I'm like, this isn't right just yet. So I want to read this stuff the easy way. So I just went and reread The Children of Hurin, and I'm traveling from tomorrow again, and I'm going to buy Fall of Gondolin and Beren and Luthien, and I'm going to read them. But it's so at the moment I have this little gap of a few days in between my winter Tolkien project, and I couldn't sleep last night, the night before, because I was a bit unwell. And I'm like, I can't sleep. I'll have to read something. So I come in here and I look on the bookshelf, and my Le Guin stuff is next to my Tolkien stuff, obviously. But how else would you arrange it? And I'm like, I should reread The Earth Secret. It's like, no, because there's always medicine in there. But I had reread it within the last couple of years. There's also not enough time to read all 5 of them in my little Tolkien gap. But it's funny you mentioned that. There's always medicine in the Gwyn, and I went reaching for it. No. All right, guys. Well, I'm going to give it another second or two. And if we don't get a question paste, I will bid you adieu. All right, I think, well, it's 2 hours. We did good. I mean, I did talk for, the presentation was the longest one yet. I've never read them, but did because of your recommendation. I had a question, same as theirs, and it was there for me. That's how she works. All right. I'm glad that my show or whatever was the stirring inside you that got you to got you to discover Grandmother Ursula. Is there another Rune Soup interview lined up? There is always. So in theory, it's fortnightly solo show, guest, solo show, guest. That's how we do it. But yeah, I've got a couple couple in the can already, and they're doozies. Have a good evening for most of you, and day for some of you.